allyship is not enough, and we need to push beyond allyship and really go all in on these conversations.
Hey there, folks. Welcome to today's episode of the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. I'm super grateful to be sharing with you today. A podcast brought to you by SME Strategy. We facilitate strategic planning sessions and we help leaders get aligned and on the same page. So if you've ever heard the expression, what's in your wallet, you might think of like a brand connotation there. And what I want you to think about is, what is in your company? What is in your office? What is in your boardroom? Well, today I am joined by Mike Lynch, who spent 24 years at Capital One. And he's led HR teams from international HR teams. And today I get to speak with him about his newest book, which I'm super excited about because somebody who's lived teams, who's worked teams, understand what it takes to be a good leader. And working across all of these different regions with lots of different people, you need to be able to build good teams, which requires you to be inclusive and understanding of different people's perspectives. So, Mike, I'm so grateful to chat with you today. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Yay. Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here with you. And let me just clarify, when you say a good leader, I would sort of say in constant learning mode leader is what I aspire to. So,
okay,
just to clarify.
Excellent. Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that as it's been said, leadership is a mountain with no top. And I think, right. The spirit of the book is to be able to reflect on oneself's biases, conscious or unconscious. And I say this as a straight white guy, which is like literally the preface of your book. And just to recognize, how we can kind of check our assumptions and to be an ally, move from ally to all in. But why don't you tell our listeners about you, about the book, and we'll get into some questions.
Sure. I did not really set out to write a book about this or even sort of go into this particular thing, but I felt compelled to do it. One of the things that the reason I felt compelled is because when I, started to really look into sort of how do I, as a leader, really, be better at being more inclusive, I started to look out there to sort of see what resources there were where I could just continue to develop and learn for myself. And what I found was that there just weren't a lot of tools or a lot of resources that were out there. There were a lot of resources out there around the topic of inclusion or diversity or equity, but there wasn't a lot for people who look like me as a middle-aged, gray-haired white guy. And so I just got super curious about that and started to kind of look around. And like I said, I wasn't really finding a lot. So I then set out to sort of say, okay, like what do I know to be true? And started to put together just some thoughts and a framework around how do I get myself being beyond allyship and to go all in on these conversations.
Excellent. I love that. So how did how did it come to be? So 24 years in HR, working, basically all the way up within the same organization. How did that play out in your kind of like practical work? How did you, recognize as a gray-haired white guy, but even earlier stages when you might not have had gray hair, the impacts or misalignment between allyship in organizations, and where did you recognize, or how did you come to be that recognized that it was, something important and critically valuable to incorporate?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that I felt when working in HR, keeping diversity on the agenda was really important, right? It was always, part of our people strategy to kind of keep it up there. What I would find though is that, it was a struggle to keep it sort of in the top five of topics to kind of talk about. It was just one of those things that just continually sort of slid down the list, or like, it's just so inconvenient. We'll get to that in the next, next meeting, next quarter, next year of really kind of pushing for that. And so, and then what we really found was that we were, a lot of really good intention and really good intention was there. It's just, like I said, it was just sort of a lack of actually how to go about doing it and how to actually make it stick and sustain the strategies that we were, that we aspired to kind of have in there. So intent was always there. And, I was really fortunate to work for a really progressive organization that, really valued sort of talent within the organization. It's just, actually, one thing I will share, Anthony, is one thing I sort of started to notice is we tended to go and almost outsource some of when I say outsource, it was from the leader's perspective, we would go out and ask underrepresented groups of like, hey, come back, go out there and tell us what you need, and then come back and sort of tell us what you want. And then we'll sort of see what we can sort of do work there. My premise, and a lot of the premise I sort of talk about in the book, is I feel like we missed the boat in a lot of the efforts that we've done around in the inclusion space by not asking leaders, most of whom again look like me, white males, to actually do the hard work and kind of go and do this and actually go out and start to do some work for themselves around what is their relationship with with race, with gender, and how do they sort of work in this, because it's not something that we typically are challenged to really face in that space.
So if I understand what you're saying is kind of the burden of the work of allyship and inclusion was put on folks that might be underrepresented or marginalized historically, whereas the opposite of that is like it's actually the work is on the leader, that either is the leader supporting the group or those that might not necessarily have a full context or understanding of their relationship to marginalized groups, let's say.
Yep, absolutely. And this is, where that sort of the allyship comes in. So you sort of, what I found, or what I, and continue to find in the work that I do and working with leaders is, again, there's, most leaders sort of, get up every day and sort of want to be good leaders, right? And continue to learn and to be inclusive and sort of attract the right talent. And what I find is a lot of leaders will say, oh, like, I'm an ally. Like, of course, like I'm an ally. Like I have daughters, or, I live, my neighbor is Black, or I'm friends with, a lesbian couple who lives next door, and, things like that. And, my premise that I have is like, hey, allyship is not enough, and we need to push beyond allyship and really go all in on these conversations, especially as, straight white men, in that allyship is really just the beginning of this process. And we need to continue to push in that, because, that's really kind of how we're going to kind of move the needle and sort of move the needle in this conversation. And as well as realize the benefits of inclusive workplace and communities for ourselves.
So I think moving from just like, it's kind of the allyship is checking the box and performative, whereas the all-inness is what actually makes a difference and makes progress in those areas. If I got what you're saying. Yeah. So like, tell us, like in practice, how did this work? Obviously, the process of writing a book and doing the self-reflection, but, I believe for-profits should think more like nonprofits. I think nonprofits should think more like for-profits. And right now in the world, some people are thinking this is a nice to have versus a must have. You could have it as a must have, of course, as like human beings, as a society. Unfortunately, in our capitalist society, what drives many decisions is money. And so what did you find in terms of the balance of, when allies move from all in and teams become supportive, inclusive, understanding, and supporting one another? What does it do in the realm of performance? What does it do in terms of other HR measures?
Sure. And, here's the thing. There are a ton of studies out there around that prove out the fact of that having an inclusive workforce like drives innovation, drives profit. People can go out and sort of look for those studies, and that's not sort of the argument that we're looking to that's the argument. The argument has been made and it's been proven. It's been studied over and over again. McKinsey's done a few reports on this exact sort of topic. And, there are there's evidence that is out there around the more people feel like they belong sort of in the workplace, it drives innovation, it drives engagement, it drives retention of the talent, and which are all things, from, at least from an HR perspective, and even from these, from a corporate perspective, you want to kind of make sure that you're tracking those things and keeping those things, engagement high, retention high, for the right talent and things like that too. So it definitely has an impact on a lot of the metrics that we tend to track from an HR perspective.
So let's think about non-HR people, because you're kind of like in some cases preaching to the choir for good HR folks. What about, let's say, listeners listening to this and they're considering that there's an opportunity to challenge their own biases, assumptions, knowns and unknowns, what are one or two practical steps that somebody can take that isn't in HR to be able to move from allyship to being all in within, kind of the average work week, work month?
Sure. I mean, the first, what I've done is develop a framework to help leaders kind of work through sort of how do you get from ally to all in. And right, you can sort of slide up and down kind of that model or the framework. And the first couple steps I would say, which are really easy steps to start on, is the first one is just awareness. Like just start being aware, right? Around how do you show up in the room? Like, are there reactions that people have when you do kind of show up in the room as a leader there? For example, one of the things I found which I started to notice a little bit, is that sort of the head of the table was always sort of left open, for meetings. And I was like, what's going on with that? There's no assigned seats here, and it was like, oh, well, the way that I sort of interpreted it or sort of like got feedback is like, your privilege walks in the door, 5 minutes before you do, because people sort of just assume like that's sort of what it's made for and things like that. So just, really kind of creating that space of awareness. And if you're not getting feedback, by the way, around sort of your inclusive leadership, the biggest thing I do when I coach leaders is sort of say, hey, check your ecosystem, right? Like, why are you not getting that feedback? Like, we're not all perfect in this space. We all slip up. We all are programmed in certain ways and grew up in different ways and things like that. And so there are constantly sort of places where we can do some course correction, right? And if you're not hearing that feedback along the way, you need to sort of start to create some awareness around how do you get that feedback in there. And then the second thing I would sort of add really quick on that is just to start to acknowledge that, of just sort of starting to say, hey, I noticed when, I walk into the room, like this chair is always empty, like what's happening there? Or acknowledging sort of that awareness that you're starting to have, and just get super curious about it and what's happening with that, and asking questions about that. The other tip that I give a lot of leaders as well is work with other leaders or other sort of, in particular, right? Like the last thing I want to do is put the burden on underrepresented groups to teach me how to be more inclusive, right? And so, they have enough sort of working to sort of get to sort of what they need to do, and, figure out sort of the rules of the organization, how they're doing. So a lot of times I'll say to leaders like, hey, partner up with, someone else, another leader, potentially another white guy, to sort of say, hey, like, can you give me feedback? Did I reference too many? Were there too many sports references in that particular kind of meeting, or things like that too? Now, the one thing I would caution is like, be careful you're not creating an echo chamber in this as well, because that can happen easily as well. But just the awareness that you create, it then starts to move into other parts of the model around creating accountability for you as well, so you can get feedback on those things.
Excellent. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I was watching clips of, the movie Remember the Titans, Denzel Washington. And it was interesting because, for those of you, not that I want to make a sports reference, but here we are, is that, typically white team, and I think in the South or Midwest, and then basically an all black team, it basically merged together. And, his approach was, get to know one of your teammates of another race. And of course, race is not the only thing to consider, but known and seen is to be understood. And so how can you, if you have differences of people, how can you spend time with them? How can you, be curious about their life? And you can't support them fully if you don't have the understanding. So as white guys walking around the world with lots of privilege, not everybody has the same knowns and beliefs and privileges that we do. And being curious is one of those first steps to being able to support that.
Sure. Hey, Anthony, the one thing I would add on that, just to kind of, is like, whether we like it, whether we don't like it, there's a story around us, around like, how inclusive are we? Right? As leaders.
We as a team, or we as individuals?
As an individual, there's a story about you, about how inclusive are you. And right. And so for me, like, I'd rather sort of know what that story is, and then be able to kind of go and, one, understand it, be aware of it, understand it, and then start to, if it's a negative story around inclusion, then like, hey, how do I go about kind of atoning for that and rectifying some of that as well? Because I may not even fully understand sort of why that story is about me in there. So, but like, that's the thing I think a lot of leaders sort of think of, like, that is something like people, you have a brand around your inclusion. So go figure out what that is.
Interesting. And so it talked about some things as individuals. What about as teams? Because I think, for this to be able to move forward holistically, there are the ones that are going to drive it, of course, are the leaders within the organization, and those leaders have teams. What are things that teams can do as part of their kind of regular work to support these conversations so that they are maybe not as heavy, maybe not as intense, but rather like built into the fabric of how they work, so that someone else coming in can be walking into an inclusive and supportive environment?
Yeah, I would say it's similar to what I talked about with the ecosystem. Like as a team, sort of what those norms, establish what those norms are within a team, and really inclusivity could be one of those norms where you are checking in with one another. Maybe it's at the beginning of the meeting of like, hey, is there someone who wants to sort of look out for a particular language that we're using, or that, maybe not as inclusive as we'd like to be, and creating an ecosystem where someone can sort of say, hey, wait, hang on, like that's the third sports reference you've made in that meeting, or something like that. So creating that ecosystem within that team as well. And then doing postmortems at the end, like, hey, how are we doing with this? Like, how are we feeling about it? I even had meetings too where like we sort of go around the room and sort of give each other, or you sort of rate the meeting, like how do we do, 1 out of 5, and then if you're sort of scoring a little bit low, then hey, tell us more, like why do we score low, and what can we do to kind of up our score in the next meeting that we're in, things like that. So it's really creating that accountability amongst the team as well.
Interestingly enough, I was in a conversation earlier today with someone in Chicago, and the two leaders, board chair was African American or Black, and then I was like, oh yeah, I like Chicago Bears, and she was like, I used to work at the Chicago Bears, and so in that case it was perfectly acceptable, appropriate. But the point of that is to figure it out. And then also within organizations, especially if there are camps is not the correct word, groups or whatever, that like those chambers, those perspectives, those brands from the various groups within an organization, your perspective or your brand within one group might be different than your brand in another group, and being mindful of those folks, because you have to bring everybody along. I think that's the key as a leader, that you have to support your entire organization. So Mike, anything that you want to say in closing, anything else that you want to challenge our folks to do, and where can they connect with you, learn more about your work?
Sure. The one thing I would just sort of add, like right here is, like the place that I think a lot of times leaders come from, especially again, those that I tend to work with in the corporate space who, straight white males tend to come at this from a bit of fear, where, I heard a lot when I was really getting curious around this work and what was going. What I heard was like, oh, well, there's a fear of saying the wrong thing. There's a fear of, or the sense of like, hey, this is not my fight to fight, things like that. And then therefore the reaction would just be sort of shutting down or being silent. And I would just say like, hey, that silence is deafening, right? Around you not really stepping into those conversations. And from my experience in working in this space, what I find is people are much more forgiving if you're just willing to sort of start to try in this space. And right, the bar is low. The bar is low for us in this space. And so, take a risk, have some courage, and just get curious and start asking questions around this, and, try to work through the fear a little bit of saying the wrong thing and things like that too. I mean, and ultimately, right, that fear or the ability, I should say the ability to be silent, like that's the ultimate privilege right there. So, just being aware of that, recognizing that, and pushing through that, I think would be my encouragement for leaders that are listening to this.
Awesome. If nothing changes, nothing changes. And for you to be able to do a small thing, I don't know, what do they call it? Like when you step out onto the skinny branch, like you have to do the thing for something's going to move. If you don't do anything, then we're going to keep getting exactly what we got. And if as a human being and as a leader, supporting your people is important, do the thing, because that's what's important.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And where can people get a hold of you?
Yeah. So the book is called From Ally to All In. It's sold wherever books are sold. So you can get it on Amazon. There's a paperback version as well as an ebook version. So you can check it out there. Barnes & Noble also sort of sells it. So any book retailers sell it there. You can also check out my website, which is where I'd be happy to follow up, answer any questions, engage in a conversation, or provide any kind of help I can in that space, as well as LinkedIn is a great place to connect as well. So you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Mike, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure, privilege. I hope lots of people pick up your book, have a conversation around it. What I might recommend is, get books for your folks and use that as a stepping stone. One small thing is just say, hey, let's just read the cover and what does this mean to you? And that is one conversation you can take. I'm not just trying to help Mike sell books, but probably wouldn't be the worst if he did that. So Mike, thank you for joining us today. It has been such a pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Anthony.
Folks, my guest today, Mike Lynch, the author From Ally to Ally, All In, your guide to moving beyond privilege and becoming a more inclusive leader. I think one of the critical things as leaders is recognizing that we are shepherds, stewards of people in our organization, and not everybody has the same background, privilege, capacity that we do. And so just being really curious about everybody on your team, not just because of the color of their skin or where they are born, but recognizing they might look like you, but have different levels of privilege, ability, understanding, and to support all of us as human beings. So be sure to check out the book. Be sure to connect with him on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe because we love just sharing with you and having you listen from all of our great folks, whether here or on YouTube. And then if you're looking to have other conversations with your team in the form of strategic planning or aligning on any other topic for your leadership team, be sure to reach out to us, SMEstrategy.com, and we'd be happy to support. So folks, this has been the Strategy and Leadership Podcast. My name is Anthony Taylor. Thanks for being here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.